This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Christopher Holmes. Dr. Holmes is the John H. Stembler Jr. Scholar in Residence and Director of Biblical and Theological Education at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the author of the brand new book, Unspoiled Endings, Reclaiming the Book of Revelation from Misuse and Neglect, out now on Fortress Press. This accessible introduction to Revelation will help readers better understand how Revelation works and the relevance of Revelation for today. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Holmes, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, thanks so much, Alex, for the invitation. I'm excited to be with you and with your listeners.
When I saw that Fortress was releasing this book, I knew I had to get it. I've wanted to have an actual biblical scholar on the show to talk about Revelation for a really long time. But before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Alex. So as you said, I live in Atlanta, Georgia. We live in Southeast Atlanta, not far from the zoo, if you know the Atlanta area. I'm married to Janelle. We have two teenagers, Micah and Darcy. Micah is 16. Darcy is 14 going on 34. Janelle, my wife, is also a pastor within the Presbyterian church tradition. She's actually a church planner in Southeast Atlanta. So she's been leading a new worshiping community out there for about almost 8 years now. And so that's part of our family culture, part of our life, lots of dinner time conversations about the church. We moved to Atlanta in 2011 for me to do my PhD at Emory University, where I completed it in 2016. We had moved from Princeton, New Jersey, where I did my MDiv at Princeton Seminary, and I did my undergraduate at a small liberal arts college out in Spokane, Washington called Whitworth University. And after my PhD, we stayed in Atlanta. I worked for a very short time with SBL Press, and then I did a 2-year teaching postdoc at McAfee School of Theology, which is the divinity school for Mercer University. And after that, I had what I would call a gap year. Think about like the gig economy for higher education. I had anywhere between 5 and 7 part-time jobs, lots of online teaching, some curriculum development. Never was on the side of the street, but maybe it felt like I might be there with a sign, we'll teach for a meal. But I made it out. And then in July of 2019, so just over 5 years ago, I started this position as a scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta.
I want to talk about that position a little bit because you are in a very unique position as a biblical scholar who works for a church. So how did this role come about, and what's it like being someone who's in academics but also working in like a practical ministry setting?
Yeah, perfect. So the short story with this position is actually it's the result of a single individual's generosity who when he died, he was a member of the church, grew up in the church. And when he died, he gave basically a third of his estate to 3 institutions. One was to a private high school here in Atlanta. One was to the film school at UNC, and the other was to this church, to First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. That's John H. Stembler Jr., the title, the name in my title. And he gave the gift with a very sort of broad directive to create a Sunday school for the teaching of Bible, theology, and biblical history. And his gift was so significant, though, that you can imagine it would buy a lot of donuts, buy a lot of coffee. And so they experimented with ways to live into that position. They did some travel tours. They would often invite scholars from other parts of the country to come in and maybe do a talk on Saturday, preach on Sunday. And then just about a decade ago, the current head of staff and the session re-envisioned this as a full-time position. And they said, there are some churches, there are some places that have a part-time theologian or scholar in residence, usually a retired seminary professor who, might teach a class here or there, very limited role on the staff and within the congregation. And their brilliant idea was to say, let's imagine this as a full-time position. Let's imagine it as a robust scholar in residence position, not a sort of glorified Christian education position, although there's nothing wrong with that position. And so I actually heard about this position when I was a 4th-year PhD student. I didn't apply at that time because I wasn't far enough along. I thought to be competitive. Um, but my good friend Ryan was preceded me in this position, and so he and I talked, and I continued to follow it. And when he transitioned out, I was made aware of this opening and applied it. And the way that I describe this job is it's a unicorn position. I'm not quite sure it really exists, right? At least on paper and most of my time here, I'm encouraged, I'm challenged to be active in the scholarly guild, to teach in local seminaries, to continue my own writing and research. But in addition, I'm tasked with bringing sort of innovative and accessible theological education to the church. And so I get to be a generalist here. I teach a lot of Bible classes, but I teach a lot of stuff that my PhD didn't teach me anything about. But I did learn how to read up on a subject in my PhD program. And so I get to teach Old Testament and New Testament and theology and church history. To answer what is it like, it's really great. I feel like I'm always trying to connect these two bigger, broader conversations. One is the conversation that's going on in the Guild of Biblical Scholarship with new publications, with old publications, with new questions and old questions. Very often that conversation is very technical and insider focused. And I'm trying to sort of take the best of that and find ways to connect it with the conversation about the Bible in the church, about theology in the church. And so I would say in the past 5 years, my placement in the church has shaped sort of both my research questions and my teaching in really profound ways. And so this book that you mentioned, Unspoiled Endings, really is it's a product of this church. It's born in this church. And it really is sort of a testament, I guess, to the sorts of questions that being a biblical scholar fully housed in a church produces. And I'm also ordained. I'm also on the pastoral staff, so that's a whole other layer of I'm preaching. I'm involved in the weekly worship, and so that also is shaping how I think about scholarship and also how I think about teaching, whether it's teaching here or somewhere else in the community.
Well, you picked a really interesting topic to write a book about, and I think you're absolutely right in saying that it's a book that is definitely informed by biblical scholarship, but very accessible to the average reader. But the topic, the Book of Revelation, that is a very controversial topic, and it's one of the reasons why I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about it on my show in the past, is because it can be so complex, and there are a lot of people that have very, very strong opinions about how to interpret the Book of Revelation.
Sure.
So, being in a pastoral role like yours, I'm sure there's a little bit of danger in writing a book about Revelation, because there might be people in your congregation that have a different perspective on it than you do. And in my experience, again, sometimes people are very, very passionate about their interpretation of Revelation. So what motivated you to write a book on the Book of Revelation?
Yeah. I think, if you've been to seminary, or certainly people that have pursued advanced degrees in biblical studies, there's this ever widening gap between what a layperson knows, understands, thinks about any of the biblical writings, and sort of where the scholarly conversation is. And I would say that the gap is maybe biggest or largest with the Book of Revelation. Yeah. So the sort of on the street corner, riding in the bus, sitting in the pew next to you, at least in my context, the understanding of Revelation is so different than the one that you learn at a Christian college, than the one that you would learn at a seminary, or certainly that you would experience if you're reading, a New Testament journal or an academic work. And so I just thought, this is a great test for me. It was actually the book grew out of the very first class that I taught here at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. It was a Wednesday night class. We had about 30 or 40 people come. We had some joining online, some in person. And it really was like, if I can make Revelation accessible, if I can help narrow that gap between what scholars are saying about Revelation and what my folks are saying about Revelation and folks in their circles are saying about Revelation, then I think I've lived into the vision of this scholar in residence position. And so, yeah, it was risky. I think at my in my congregation, in the book, I talk about sort of two broad reactions to Revelation. On the one hand, there's like this sort of obsession with it. Everything is read through some version of reading Revelation, particularly with some view of the end times, or there's absolute neglect. Don't touch it, don't engage it, don't even talk about it. And I think for my congregation, the majority of people here are probably in that latter camp where they just don't know what to do with it. They probably haven't heard many sermons on it. And so it's better to just sort of allow it to exist on its own and not engage it. And so I think I did have some freedom there, that I wasn't wrestling with people who were trying to make me, a pre-dispensationalist or a post-dispensationalist or any of these sort of broader ecclesial and theological frameworks for reading Revelation. I felt like I got to do some really creative, fun work. And in many ways, for me, that class was my first deep dive into the book of Revelation as I was preparing the lectures, as I was reading the secondary scholarship, and trying to frame it in a way that would seem accessible to the church. And so from that class was in October of 2019. I thought, man, that there was some enthusiasm here. It seemed to work. And so I wrote up a book proposal, sent it to Fortress, and was fortunate to have that accepted. And I started writing in January of 2020, thinking it was going to be like an 18-month project. We all know what happened in March of 2020. So the timeline got extended a little bit. But I think fortuitously, it enabled me to sort of explore the ideas a bit more in a variety of settings. I have since taught some seminary level classes on Revelation, taught other classes here in the church. And so I think that the delay really only helped solidify and feed what became the final product.
So I, a couple of months ago, preached a sermon at my church where I used the book of Revelation as like a source text. And there was an older woman who came up to me after the sermon and said, when I heard that you were preaching about the book of Revelation, I almost walked out because that book scares me. But then she said, I'm glad I stayed because it makes a little bit more sense now. And that tends to be the response that I've seen from a lot of people when they're first encountering kind of the academic literature, the academic mentality of reading the book of Revelation. What was your experience like just with the lay people in your church going through the book of Revelation? What was the reception that you got from that?
Yeah, I think very similar. I mean, I think many people are sort of repelled by it. I would say many are repelled by it because of its misuse. That's the subtitle of the book, because of how it's been misinterpreted, misappropriated in some popular and academic ways. But it's also on its own, on its own right. It is a weird book, right? It doesn't fit. It's not directly narrative like the Gospels and Acts. It's not fully a letter like Paul's letters or James or Hebrews. It has imagery that is hard to wrap your head around. It just doesn't fit in the New Testament and barely fits in the whole biblical canon. And so people, initially are reticent. They're initially like, I'm not interested in Revelation. Like, that's for those other people. That's for that other church down the street, not for this church. But I think as you begin to introduce things, as you begin to move slowly through the 22 chapters of Revelation, people begin to see that it's more accessible, right? It's more relevant to their faith life than simply a timetable for the end of the world. And so, I think probably the biggest compliment that I've received from the classes that I've taught or from writing the book is if somebody simply says, I'm not afraid to read Revelation anymore. Like if I can get to that point, great. They don't have to understand everything. They don't have to say like, I love it or I like it. But if they can say, what, I'm not intimidated anymore. I feel comfortable moving around in the book of Revelation. I think that's a huge success. That may not be the case with all of the New Testament when I teach different parts of the New Testament, but certainly for Revelation, that's a good place, right? If they feel equipped to read and reread, then I think that's a win for me.
I completely agree with that. And we're going to get into the book of Revelation right now. And so what I would like to ask all of my audience members to do is just take everything that you think you know about the book of Revelation, set it to the side, listen to Chris explain everything to you and just allow him to hit you with this information, because I really do think that everything you just said about once you view it from a historical perspective, it really does change how we approach the text, I think, in a very positive way. So I'm hoping that people can suspend their judgment for just a little bit and hear what we have to say. One of the things that you point out at the very beginning of your book is that in the opening chapter of Revelation, all of the main themes are kind of outlined. And it's really in the first 9 verses that you get a sense of what you're going to be reading throughout the rest of the work. So what do these opening passages in Revelation tell us about the book as a whole?
Yeah. So I think there's a trick, right? That if you could probably take almost any writing in the New Testament and say, let's an hour, spend 30 minutes just thinking about the first chapter. And very often the first chapter is going to set the stage for that writing. It's true of Paul's letters. It's true of the Gospel of Luke, right? As we're approaching Advent, as we're approaching the story of Christmas, there's so much bound up in those first 2 chapters of Luke that tell us about what Luke is going to be like in comparison and in distinction to Matthew or Mark or the Gospel of John. And I think the same can be done with the book of Revelation. And so what I do is I just take the first 9 verses, and I sort of ask us a number of questions. What do these 9 verses tell us about the basic data, the starting point for the book of Revelation? So we learn a lot about who wrote it in these first verses. We learn that there is a person named John who is writing from the island of Patmos near Asia Minor. We don't know exactly who this John is. The text doesn't tell us that. In biblical, in larger church tradition, the 4th gospel and the letters of John and Revelation are all attributed to John, and they're all assumed to be the same John. But Revelation is actually the only of those 5 writings. It's the only one that actually names John. So this is where we get the idea of the Johannine community or the Johannine tradition. The name John is only linked with the book of Revelation. And what's interesting is it doesn't say, I'm John. I was a former fisherman. I followed after Jesus. I, was a son of thunder, and I tended to misspeak. Instead, we learn that John is a witness, and he is a co-laborer, a co-conspirator, we might say, with the audience members. And so his relationship and his identity is really bound up with his connection, both with the churches that he's going to be writing to, and with Jesus, and with the story of Jesus, and with the calling of God and the work of God. And so we learn a lot about just the author in these first nine verses. And I think we learn a lot about the first readers, or more likely the first hearers of the book of Revelation. It's very likely that the first experience of Revelation, for the first few centuries maybe, would have been one that was taken in through the ears rather than through the eyes. And so we learn that there are these 7 churches in Asia Minor that are identified as the recipients of this letter. Scholars, there's various interpretations about why these 7 cities, and is there any rhyme or reason to their order? What I've sort of rested on is that these become sort of representative cities in the larger area of Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. That they represent the sort of religious and political world that was active throughout that area. And so, I'm one to maybe not differentiate a ton from Sardis to Philadelphia to these various cities, and instead sort of think of them more broadly. And of course, there's a whole stream of scholarship that would disagree with me on that. But if we think about them as a distinct communities living in Asia Minor, Asia Minor was a popular place in early Christianity. A number of Paul's letters intersect with Asia Minor. It was also a place where Judaism was quite strong and quite represented. And of course, there were a variety of non-Jewish and non-Christian religions, especially the veneration of the emperor, where the imperial propaganda and the worship of the emperor was pretty prominent in certain parts of Asia Minor. And so we learn not just that there are these cities, we also learn that they're suffering persecution and hardship, likely because they refuse to participate or to accommodate to the religious and political demands that are surrounding them. And so we learn about the author, we learn about the audience, and then finally we learn about the writing itself. And so if you some versions will refer to this writing as the apocalypse instead of the revelation of John, and that gets us closer to the Greek word that we see in these first verses of apocalypsis, which can mean an uncovering, it can mean revelation. And so we learn from this designation that this, I think, and this is how I read it, that this is a particular type of writing. It's a particular way of communicating information. It's an unveiling. It's a getting behind the curtain, you might say, of reality. And that's going to be really important as we read the rest of Revelation through chapter 22, to keep in mind that one of the purposes, maybe not the only purpose, but one of the purposes of the book of Revelation is to unveil, it's to reveal. And here, I would just suspend the idea that what it reveals is a timetable, right? Which is a very traditional way of reading Revelation. I would say before it reveals a timetable, it reveals divine perspective on human events. It tells us maybe what's just behind this, the curtain of life. How does evil work in the world? What's going on in the otherworldly realities of heaven? These are things that have a timeless quality to them. And so if we suspend the question of is Jesus coming back in exactly 36 days and 4 hours, and instead say, how does this unveil reality? How does this reveal what's really real? Then we're probably in a much better, stronger place, at least from my perspective. So again, that's just from the first 9 verses. You can really sort of begin to unpack, begin to think through what is Revelation up to, and that can give you some guidance as a reader, or if you were in the ancient world as a hearer.
Yeah, no, and you very helpfully follow that up with 4 what you call mental anchors, which are essentially reading strategies for approaching the book of Revelation. And these are ideas that every reader should keep in their mind as they're going through Revelation, and they're coming across passages that seem to be very difficult. So what are those 4 mental anchors, and how can they help us better understand the book of Revelation?
Yeah, so I say that the 4 anchors are 1, keep it together, 2, emphasis, not sequence, 3, I refer to the mosaic of Israel's scriptures, and finally I say it's a text to be experienced. So let me say just a word about each of those. So first, keep it together is really just an exhortation to the reader to say, don't stop reading after the letters to the churches in Revelation 3. I mean, if I'm going to hear a sermon series, if I'm going to hear a Sunday school on Revelation, 95% of the time it's going to end at chapter 3, because that's the safe stuff. That's the stuff that we're, not so scared of, not so intimidated by. But really, we can't read those letters independent of the visions that follow in chapters 4 through 22. We really need to be able to hold them all together. And so keeping it together is really important. The second thing is when we think about those visions, so from chapter 4 through 22, but especially chapters 6 through 16, thinking through these as a matter of emphasis rather than sequence. So there, in these chapters, there's a series of 7. 7 things get opened, 7 things appear, and there's some redundancy, and there's some similarities and some differences. And I think we do ourselves a favor when we read these not as 21 distinct moments in the end of the world, but perhaps as 3 versions of the same events, or if you think about a kaleidoscope, right? Like we're turning the kaleidoscope just a little bit more, or to a different angle, to the left or to the right, to see the same things, but maybe in a slightly different way. So that's the emphasis rather than sequence. The third thing to keep in mind is just to be on the lookout for how the author is using and repurposing Israel's scriptures, Israel's sacred traditions. Some of the strangest, weirdest stuff in Revelation is actually straight from the book of Ezekiel or from Isaiah. It's like, it's not that strange. It's not that weird if you've been in some of these weirder books in the Old Testament. And so being able to be on the lookout for how the author is both using and then repurposing these traditions is really important. And then finally, Mark Allen Powell, who teaches at Luther Seminary, says that Revelation is first a text to be experienced before it is to be interpreted or decoded. And I think that this is just an appeal to taking the literary quality, the symbolic quality of Revelation, even the aesthetic quality of Revelation, and thinking about not just how can I rationally unpack it, decode it, but how does it shape my imagination? How do I experience it? Right. One of my favorite examples of this is in Revelation 4 and 5. There are these heavenly worship scenes, and you have this smoke that is rising into the presence of God. And the author of Revelation tells us that this incense is the prayers of the persecuted earthly communities. And it's just this beautiful picture. If you think that there's a first century congregation that might have had incense burning in their own congregation, right, as a part of their worship, and how just the idea of incense smoke connects the earthly and the heavenly in such a profound way. I can explain it. We could do research on what kind of incense it is, or where did they buy it, or how did they light it. But really, it captures the imagination. It captures the experience of, wow, if I'm worshiping in an embodied way in the first century, and I see and I smell and I experience this incense, Revelation's telling me that that's connected to what's going on up in heaven. And my prayers are making their way up into the presence of the divine. And I think that that's just a really beautiful way. Again, it doesn't get us off the hook from some of the harder work, but if we lead with, man, what does this text do for our imagination? What does this text do for us as we read it? It opens up some new venues and new avenues for thinking about it.
I think one of the most fundamental issues that we have to grapple with if we want to understand the book of Revelation is its genre. And in the second chapter of your book, you deal with this. So Revelation is a part of a genre of literature called apocalyptic. And you explain what apocalyptic literature is, and then you talk about how Revelation works as a manifestation of the genre of apocalyptic. So I want to go over both of those right now. Explain to my audience what apocalyptic literature is, and then we'll talk about how Revelation works as an example of that genre.
Yeah. So I think it might be helpful, and maybe this will be too much review for your listeners, but just to think through what a genre is, right? Genres they're scholarly constructs. Think of them as big baskets for sorting laundry. You put your colors in one, your whites in another, your delicates in another. One family to the next may disagree about, what's a delicate and what's not a delicate. And so there might be some differences, but putting things in these baskets helps us sort of understand them. And it helps us see similarities within what's in that basket, as well as differences from what's outside of the basket. And so a genre in biblical studies is sort of a scholarly construct that helps us, identify literature. And so we're saying in the book to put Revelation in the basket of apocalyptic literature. And there's a very technical, very well-regarded definition of apocalyptic by John J. Collins, who taught Old Testament for a number of years at Yale University. And I give the whole definition in the book, but let me just sort of give you the high points of this definition. That apocalyptic is first of all revelatory literature. As I said, it's unveiling, it's revealing. Very often, it's revealing ideas or concepts or perspectives that would be otherwise unavailable to a human audience. So it's sort of secret knowledge. It's behind the curtain knowledge. The second is that it's often given in a narrative framework. So there's often a narrative, moving from point A to point B to point C in the story. One of the most famous examples of apocalyptic literature are the books of Enoch, first Enoch. And, Enoch is going, he's up in heaven, and then he's going to this star, and he's going then, to the underworld, and he's doing this and he's doing that. So there's this narrative, there's this movement, there's a character or multiple characters that are involved. Apocalyptic literature provides access to transcendent reality. It provides the human seer and then the subsequent readers and hearers of this literature access to these transcendent realities. And these transcendent realities in apocalyptic literature tend to be of one or two significant ways. So they can reveal spatial dynamics. That can be the transcendent reality. So think heaven, or think hell, or Gehenna, or other places like that. Lots of heavenly locales, supernatural locales. And so that's part of the transcendent reality, is the spatial dimension. The other is more of a chronological or time perspective. Some apocalyptic literature is dealing with what's going to happen at the end of time. Whenever time comes to an end, it's a linear version of history. When it reaches its end, that's what some apocalyptic literature is interested in. Some is also interested in the before time. It's interested in creation or the prehistory, we might say. But in any case, apocalyptic literature is revealing these transcendent realities. And I think one of the goals with my work with this book is to say some of the strangeness of Revelation, some of the weirdness can go away if we just have a little bit of a better understanding of how apocalyptic works, about what apocalyptic is, and about what apocalyptic is up to and what it's doing. My own thinking has been shaped by the likes of John Collins. One of my teachers at Emory, Carol Newsom, has a great piece in the Women's Bible Commentary on apocalyptic literature, where she argues that apocalyptic literature is crisis literature. And I think that that's a really helpful way for us to think about apocalyptic literature. It may not be true of all versions, all of the writings that get put in the bucket of apocalyptic literature, but it is really helpful for many of them. And so one of the things that Dr. Newsom will talk about is the persecution of Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BCE. Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek ruler who did a number of really traumatic things to the Jewish people. He sacrificed a pig in the temple. He forbade circumcision. There were a variety of other forms of persecution. And when we think about apocalyptic literature as crisis literature, we're saying that it's responding to a crisis. And it's responding, I think, to a crisis of human evil, of maybe natural evil, but it's also responding to a crisis of theology. And so a very traditional Old Testament theology that we find in the book of Proverbs, that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, is good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, right? I mean, that's not the language of Deuteronomy, but it is. The language is in Deuteronomy. If you obey, you are going to be blessed, and if you disobey, you're going to be cursed. And so in the aftermath of something like Antiochus Epiphanes, the theology is broken, because there's no way to account for, hey, we were so bad that this happened, right? There's no way for us to wrap our brains around like that amount of human evil and say, oh yeah, that's right, because I was disobedient, the system breaks. And so apocalyptic literature then is a responding to this profound human evil and trying to make sense of God's sovereignty, about God's judgment. When is God going to render judgment? This is apocalyptic literature is really where we get the most developed understandings and anticipations of resurrection, because they're saying, man, the evildoers are not getting judgment in their lifetime, and those who are faithful and obedient aren't getting rewards in their lifetime. And so what we need then is we need God to handle this on the other side of death. And so you get in a number of apocalyptic writings, the raising of both the righteous and unrighteous, and they're judged. Some go on to eternal life. or they become stars, as the book of Daniel puts it. And some cease to be, or some are punished. But again, it's this crisis. It's a crisis of theology that says, how do we do this? How do we make sense of a good, powerful, loving, just God when we see the chaos of the world around us? And so another one of my teachers from Emory, Carl Holliday, who's a New Testament professor, says that in response to this crisis, that apocalyptic literature emphasizes the sovereignty of God. It provides access to divine reality or divine perspective. It tells us, what you're seeing, the chaos, the brokenness that you're seeing, that's not it. That's not the end of the story. So there's, let me show you in, let me give you a little insider information about what's really happening. And ultimately, apocalyptic literature stresses God's ultimate victory and the vindication of God's people. And so that's where, if you read Revelation to the end, you get to victory, you get to access to divine reality, you get, ceaseless worship, but you have to go through some chaos and some lament and some hardship to get there. And in many ways, I think that is in line with a lot of how apocalyptic works generally. And I know you asked before, how does Revelation sort of fit within that? For the most part, it fits quite well. We have a character named John. John talks about his experience of being transported to heaven. John shares with us the things that he sees and hears and smells and experiences. And he is joined with an otherworldly interpreter, an angel, so that when John is looking around and has no idea what's going on, he's got a friend. He's got this angelic interpreter who says, "Here's what this is. Here's what this means. Here's what that is unpacking and interpreting it for him." Revelation has both the spatial and the temporal dimensions of apocalyptic literature. But it's different. It's not, we might not say it's pure apocalyptic, because it has these letters at the beginning. It takes the form of a letter, like, a very long letter, but a letter like some of the other New Testament letters. It ends and begins in that way. And there's also, other, parts of the book of Revelation that maybe move beyond apocalyptic, but in general, it functions quite well within the genre of apocalyptic. It can be very helpful to read it alongside of some of these other apocalyptic writings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Revelation is also a manifestation of prophecy, and you explain prophecy and what it means in the book. Now, I did have back in the spring John Walton, the Old Testament professor, on my show to talk about one of his new books on prophecy, and he did a great job of breaking that down. And your definition corresponded very much to him. But maybe talk about that a little bit, like how does prophecy actually work, and how does it function in Revelation?
Yeah. So this is, again, I think in the popular imagination, we tend to think about prophecy exclusively as a mode of prediction.
Yes.
So the biblical prophets, the Isaiahs, the Ezekiels, the book of Revelation, are not that much different than Nostradamus, right? Or in some circles, not much different than getting a tarot card reading or going to a fortune teller. It's not to say that the Old Testament prophets or the book of Revelation don't have a predictive element, right? Something about telling the truth about something in the future. But I think it's that we've overemphasized that the predictive time dimension, and we've really missed what I think it's Walter Brueggemann talks about the prophets as being offering a word on target, right? That they offer a word to a specific people in a specific time period who are facing specific challenges. And in order for that word to be effective, it has to be responsive. It has to be dealing with what's going on the ground. And so I've heard this idea that prophecy is more about forthtelling than future telling. It's more about declaring God's word, God's perspective, God's vision about what's happening in and around you, rather than only saying, in 700 years, there's going to be a virgin and she's going to give birth to Jesus Christ, right? Which is not a wrong way of reading prophecy. It's just a singular way. And there's other ways to read read prophets, both Old Testament prophets and the element of prophecy in the book of Revelation. Walter Brueggemann, a really helpful Old Testament scholar, teaches up the road, or taught for a long time up the road at Columbia Seminary, says that the prophetic literature is meant to nurture and nourish and invoke a consciousness and a perception that's alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture. So prophets sort of, I love what he says. They sort of speak into and speak beyond what is taken as natural or normal or expected within the dominant culture, and very often offer a different perspective. And that's the element of forthtelling that we see with prophecy. And so when I work with Revelation and I think about the elements of prophecy, the ways in which Revelation has a prophetic edge to it or is working within prophecy, I talk about I talk about these three modes of reading prophecy. One is the predictive, which I've already talked about. A second is a historical mode, which is largely this idea of gathering the word on target. What do we know about the time period of Amos, or what do we know about the time period of Ezekiel? And then a third way is what I call an analogical way of reading it. And it sort of builds on that historical. It builds on knowing that this was intended to be a word on target, a word to a particular situation. And once we see that, once we have a sense of that, we then use that as a framework for looking at our own world, looking at our own environment, and beginning to ask sort of what's an analogy? How does this also speak to our conception of reality? And I would recommend the work of Walter Brueggemann in this way, because so much of his treatment of the prophets in both super technical academic work and also very popular and accessible work is, it starts with this historical, but he's always pushing us to say, okay, what do the prophets do today, right? How do the prophets inform and shape our understanding of reality today? And so I think that that's a helpful way. It's a helpful tool in the toolbox of reading Revelation for us to think about prophecy. Prophecy is a major theme in Revelation. It's mentioned several times. Jesus is a prophet. John's a prophet. The community is identified as a community of prophets. So prophecy is a theme in Revelation. And so if we read it, we read for what is the word on target in the first century in Asia Minor. That's a historical question that gets at what was going on in Asia Minor. What was worship like? What was religion like? What was politics like? And then once we sort of grasp that and we see how Revelation speaks to that, we then can begin to make connections. We can draw analogies with our own contemporary world. So we don't have emperor worship in the Western United States or in the Western hemisphere in the United States, but you better believe that we are drawn to offer our allegiance to a variety of other systems and individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a way of drawing an analogy from that first century context into our own. What are the totalizing powers that seem to dominate and control humanity? It may not be the imperial propaganda and the sort of the tight fist of the Roman Empire anymore. But again, we can think creatively in our own context to identify those things, whether we identify those as the market or the government or health systems or whatever else, right? We can begin to draw analogies, and we use then the historical text and the historical context to sort of measure those analogies, right? How close do we get to what we understood of that historical mode of reading? Which again, I think this then gives Revelation a perennial sort of ever relevant context to it, even as we try to treat it as a text that was written in the first century to communities in Asia Minor. It then opens it up to speak to us as Christians living in Atlanta, Georgia in the 21st century, or in Kentucky in the 21st century, or in any other place throughout the world. It really can open it up in fresh ways.
Yeah, and you make the case in your book that Revelation envisions the church as a community of prophets who are called to nonviolently resist the powers of evil in the world. And you also talk a lot about how unfortunately, Revelation has been read through an individualistic frame of mind, that people think it's
Yeah.
all about them and their relationship with God. You argue that that's not the case. So, what does it mean from the standpoint of the author of the book of Revelation to say that the church is a community of prophets that are called to nonviolently resist evil?
Yeah, great. I mean, there's so much to think about that, and the first is, I think that the question that I see on billboards, that I'm sure you see in billboards, if you died today, do you know where you'd go? Right?
All the time.
Very often, that I think that question is associated with the Book of Revelation. And then you read Revelation, and my gosh, it's really interested in community. Actually, the letters themselves are written to a community of believers in different cities. You read at the end of Revelation, and it's not atomized individuals who are doing their own delightfully personal and individual things in heaven. It's a great throng of people, and a numberless crowd. And so it's really from start to finish a book about community. Not to say that there's not at all or zero interest in the fate of individuals, but it's all bound up with the state of the community. And so the focus, the interest on the community, and sort of what does Revelation, how does Revelation speak to the formation of a community, is one of the questions that I take up in the book. And one of the ways that Revelation answers that is that the community of individuals, but also collectively, are identified as witnesses. That's one of their key roles. And I think one of the functions, one of the purposes of Revelation from a community formation standpoint is to equip them to be faithful witnesses, to know the story, to know what they're supposed to say. And ultimately, that witness is that God is Lord, and that Jesus is been seated next to him, right? That we have this very theological message about who is worthy of power, who is in control ultimately, who is worthy of our allegiance. And the community is meant to declare that. They're meant to witness that with their lives and with their words, that is true for them. And what Revelation then says is that them doing that, what it implies is that if they do that, if they witness in that way, they are going to come up against some persecution. They're going to come up against some hardship, particularly in their unwillingness, I think, to participate or to accommodate to the religious and political demands of that wider world. In order to be persecuted, you had to be noticed, right? So this isn't just belief in my head or belief in my heart. It's belief that has manifested itself in certain behaviors. And so in order to have a target on my back as a first century Christian, I've had to have made a lifestyle change. I've had to stop going to the religious ceremonies in the civic center. Maybe I've withdrawn from the ancestral religions of my family. Something happened, and that's going to cause people to respond in social ostracism, to imprisonment, to the shedding of blood in some cases. And so I think that Revelation would say it's a community focused book. It's forming you to be faithful witnesses, faithful prophets. Witness and prophet are almost synonymous in that way. Who are willing to resist the demands of the emperor, but do so not with swords, not with power brokers, not with coercion, but actually simply with witnessing and then trusting themselves and entrusting themselves to God. One of the most striking images for me of the book of Revelation is that Jesus is the victorious one. There's no question that Jesus is the one who's victorious. And yet the way that he wins victory is through being utterly annihilated, through being defeated, through being made a spectacle in the Roman world. And Jesus, almost throughout all of Revelation, remains the lamb that was slain. Like the wounds don't go away, the scars don't go away. Jesus isn't Rambo Jesus in the book of Revelation. Jesus is still the slain lamb who in the great paradox of our Christian faith is victorious by being defeated. And so, I think Revelation seeks to instill this sense of victory, this paradoxical understanding of victory, and really encourages a resistance that doesn't take up arms, but is willing to point to another reality, to point to another Lord that would have been a direct challenge to Caesar and the claims of the empire, and deal with the consequences. Brian Blunt, who's a New Testament commentator, writing a wonderful commentary on Revelation, says he actually thinks of the author of Revelation as kind of a coach who's kind of whipping up the audience into a fury in order that they might even be more aggressive in their nonviolent resistance. Not that they wouldn't sneak away into the corners, but that they would more boldly profess that this is what Jesus is about and this is how God works in the world, regardless of the consequences. And I think that's a beautiful way to think through the communal element and the theme of nonviolence in Revelation.
You discuss the significance of worship in the book of Revelation, and you make the point, and this is a very, very important point for people that are listening, that the very famous vision cycles in the book of Revelation that really begin in chapter 4 and end at the end of the book in chapter 22 are both bookended by scenes of worship. So in what way is the worship of God central to the logic of Revelation?
Yeah, I think it's this idea of if we try to hold it together, right? And so even with the visions, if we hold the fact that the visions, as scary and weird and disconcerting as they might be, start with worship in 4 and 5, and they end with worship in Revelation 21 and 22. I think that takes some of the edge off. And I remember when I was probably when I was in grad school and was sitting through the Introduction to the New Testament class for the very first time as a TA. I had this idea of, Revelation is all about worship. And so as I've taught in the past at seminary levels, sometimes that's been my introduction to the book of Revelation, is simply it's all about worship. It's about who is worthy of worship, and it's about who is unworthy of worship. And it tells us about what worship entails, right? It's singing of hymns. It's embodied as we see in Revelation 4 and 5. We see the crowd of worshipers bowing and casting their crowns. It's sort of multi-sensory, as it involves our ears and our hands and our noses and our eyes. And so we sort of gives us a manual of some sorts about what worship entails. Sometimes when I've taught Revelation in the past, I've invited people to just focus on the hymns of Revelation and think through the ways in which the hymns might enrich and encourage our own worship in our contemporary settings. What would we take from those hymns? How would we rework them? How would we rethink them? And those hymns come throughout. They come not just in the cuddly stuff of Revelation 4 and 5. They come throughout the visions, where there's some rougher, more intimidating material. And so if we think about worship, and I think one of the central questions that Revelation asks of us as contemporary Christians is, what is demanding our ultimate allegiance, right? What demands our attention? What demands our money? What demands our veneration? I mentioned in the book the work of Christian Smith on cultural liturgies. I think his work and the book of Revelation are very similar here in that, humans are going to worship something. And so it's always a question of what we're worshiping. What are we venerating? Even a person who would claim to be an atheist, I think, they order their lives around a certain reality or a certain set of convictions that demands their allegiance. It takes something from them. It gives something to them. And so Revelation is in many ways a way of assessing critically in individual ways and in collective ways. What is it that demands our allegiance? And how is it pulling our allegiance away from our trust in the slain lamb and in the God who created the world? I think that that's one of the fundamental questions for the book of Revelation.
Also at the heart of the book of Revelation are these 3 cycles of judgment. And as you have made the point already, these aren't really meant to be read as a linear sort of explanation of what's going on. They're cyclical, and they're designed to kind of deepen the explanation at the beginning. And in reality, all 3 of these cycles of judgment are about the justice of God.
Yeah.
So talk to us about how those cycles work, and then about the way in which the author of Revelation reveals God's justice throughout this work.
Yeah. Here again, I really would commend the work of Brian Blunt. My own thinking about this has been so shaped by his commentary in two really significant ways. The first is just sort of how do we think about these three cycles of seven in the visions themselves. And Brian Blunt has this great image of a three-ring circus to help us explain. So again, that the emphasis, not sequence. And I haven't been to the circus in a long time, but I can still remember that, any good circus is going to have multiple things happening at once. And so you might look to the left and there might be an elephant standing on a small chair. And maybe in the center of the stage, you've got some jugglers. And maybe on the right, you've got some trapeze artists. But it's all happening at the same time. And Brian Blunt invites us to think about these visions as that same phenomenon. Sometimes when I've taught it, I've talked about like the effect in film where, like think about a 24 episode, that old show, where each episode is 1 hour of time, and it's taken place at different perspectives, at different locations, in different moments, same time. It's that same hour, but it's taken, the camera angle is different or the focus is different. I think these three visions, it can be really helpful to think about these cycles in the same way. Maybe it's not 21 distinct elements, but it's different camera angles or different perspectives on the same thing that's eventually happening. So that's the first thing that I think Brian Blunt is super helpful with regard to the visions. The second thing is just how he treats evil and the justice of God. And this is a place where many people are uncomfortable with revelation. It can be disconcerting. And he uses the metaphor of tilling a field. And I'm not a farmer. I'm everything. I can hardly grow houseplants. But I trust the metaphor that he uses, which is that in order to prepare ground for a new crop, in order to move it from being one crop to the other, you need to till that land. You need to break up that land. And that this renewal, this transformation is a necessarily violent reality. That the act of tilling, the act of turning these crops is violent. And he says that in order for God to take that which is bent towards evil and injustice and rework it and make it new, as Revelation 21:5 says, I am making all things new. That in order to do that, it's going to be disruptive. It's going to be violent. And these cycles of visions speak to that. They speak to the disruption and the violence of God's new thing. I don't think it's vindictive violence. I don't think it's sporadic or unintentional. It's not a unthought out. It's intentional that God is bringing this new thing about. And I think that the emphasis on justice, that God is in the business of uprooting evil and human sin and injustice that are like kind of baked into the created order, according to apocalyptic literature and according to Revelation. It's not just individual sins that have piled up so much that something has to be done. It's that the whole created order needs to be renewed because it has been so bent in one direction that in order to bend it in a new one, there needs to be this disruption. And so if we keep those two things in mind, and we keep in mind that these are ultimately symbolic visions, that they're using symbols, they're using metaphor to communicate what the person on the throne says in Revelation 21, I'm making all things new. And if we think about this as the process of bringing about newness, the process of uprooting those forces, those powers that masquerade as God, then I think it opens it up into a much more generative conversation, maybe a little bit less fearful, and maybe a little bit less intimidating, so that we can begin to think through it in new ways.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on the hour mark. Do you have a couple more extra minutes to finish these last few questions?
Oh yeah. So yeah, we got way more things that we could talk about. I think the one I'll say one thing about the beast in Revelation 13, the beast in Revelation 12 and 13, and then I'll end with hope, and I'll try to do so very, very briefly.
Well, I was more concerned. I just want to make sure I'm not taking up your time.
No, I'm good. No, I'm good. Yeah,
perfect. Well,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
no, all right, that's great. That's great because I really, but this is awesome stuff, and I love the direction. This is perfect. But yes, I wanted to get to because you talk about, and both of these things are connected in your book. So you talk about how the Book of Revelation names evil, and really the locus of evil in the Book of Revelation is the beast in Revelation 13, which has spawned millions and millions of
Right.
theological conspiracy theories throughout the
Correct.
ages. So I think it's going to be good to get some clarity on that. And even in the midst of that, well, again, this goes back to like what that woman at church told me. When people read the Book of Revelation and they see the vision cycles, they think that it's just a very dark and depressing book.
Right.
Like it's not. There's no optimism in Revelation whatsoever. But the reason why evil has to be named, in according to your book, is that it's because Revelation is all about hope. It's all about the overcoming of that evil.
Yeah.
So I want to get your perspective on that here. What's going on in Revelation 13? What does that have to do with evil, and how does that lead to our hope?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those super great questions. Very well stated. Um, I think a place to start, and I mentioned this in the book, is at least in a lot of the circles that I run in, there's this bipolar understanding of evil. On the one hand, we have this sense of evil that says, we've sort of outgrown the idea of evil or of devils and demons, and that was what primitive people believed, and we sort of have outgrown it. So that's one extreme. And then on the other extreme is a sense that like the devil does everything, right? So like if you spill your coffee, it's because there was a demon that wanted you to spill your coffee. Like if you're late for work because of traffic, it's because the demon there, there was a devil that was out there. And so we have this very weird engagement with evil that either says, hey, like it's not a thing anymore, we've outgrown it, or it's everywhere. And I think there's a lot, in the true Aristotelian fashion, like there's a mean, right? There's somewhere in the middle that can take evil seriously. Evil is not just imaginary, according to the Book of Revelation. Evil is not something that if you think hard enough, you won't be affected by it, or if you pray hard enough, you won't be affected by it. Evil is real. Evil is powerful. Evil, as I said earlier, is sort of baked into the created order. It's baked into the systems. It's baked into the economy. It's baked into the politics. And so I think Revelation takes evil very seriously. But one of the benefits of Revelation's engagement with evil is that it also says that evil is monstrous. It's otherworldly. It's superhuman. And there have been, and there will continue to be, tendencies to find in the dragon or in the beast from the sea or the beast from the ground, from the earth, some historical figure, some contemporary figure who is that beast, right? And if we were to line up people of all theological stripes and sit around the table and ask them, who do you think the beast is that rises from the sea? We would probably learn more about their political leanings than about their ability to read scripture.
Right.
Because who they're going to find is their political opponent. So for Luther, it was the Pope, right? And if you're reading this in McCarthyism, then the beast is somebody over in the USSR. And so I think if we hold on to the symbolic nature that Revelation could have told us exactly who he was talking about, right? He could have said, I'm talking about, this guy who lives at the corner of such and such. Instead, the author employs symbolic language, veiled language, suggestive language, that we then can, again, think about what evil is like. And so, as I said earlier, there's the predictive mode, there's a historical mode, and then there's an analogical mode of reading Revelation. And I would say we gain a lot if we think about the historical. The first beast that rises out of the sea has all of the horns and all of that. There's a lot that seems to suggest that this is a symbol of some sort for the Roman Empire and or a specific Roman emperor. So there's a tantalizing clue about this death blow that the first beast receives. It appears as though he's dead, but then he comes back to life. Well, there was a myth in antiquity that Nero had come back from the dead, and so some would say this is a reference to Nero. It may be that it's just sort of more general, about that form of power, that form of government. The second beast that's mentioned that comes out of the earth is sort of more like the hype man. This is the guy who is enforcing the veneration. excuse me, of the first one. And Eugene Boring, who actually, he recently passed away, is a New Testament professor, says that he describes the dragon and the sea beast and the land beast as the counterfeit trinity. And I think it's a beautiful image that evil is ultimately unoriginal according to Revelation. It is it's powerful, it's real, but it's limited. And so ultimately, the where Revelation ends is that although evil is real, although it's powerful, although it's chaotic, although it's disruptive, it's ultimately defeated according to the book of Revelation. And that's where we get a lot of hope, right? That if I was to summarize the message of Revelation, it is that God wins, and that's really good news. When my wife and I when she was in seminary and I was in grad school, we'd have lots of table conversation at dinner time with our toddler Micah. He was 5 at the time, 4 or 5, and we would be fighting about this theologian or that theologian, or talking about what's going on in the church. And we would look at him and we would say, Micah, the only thing that you need to know, the only thing that matters, is that God loves you. And I think that, at some level, that's a similarly simplistic message for Revelation: is God wins. God's people will be vindicated. The evil and the injustice are going to be righted. They're going to be made new, and that is tremendously good news, right? That God is making all things new. That's again in chapter 21. The speaker there doesn't use the future tense, doesn't say at some point in the distant future, when all things have come to pass, I will make all things new. The speaker says, I am making all things new. And so that promise is good news. And I think it's good news for us today that God is, in fact, making all things new, even when it doesn't seem so, even when we look around and the world is chaotic and prone towards violence and discord, that God wins because God is in the business of making all things new.
Yeah, I love that, man. I love that. Well, we have covered a lot of ground on the show today. I do want to address the subtitle of your book, which is Reclaiming the Book of Revelation from Misuse and Neglect. And I think we've dealt with kind of the interpretive issues that will help people not misuse the Book of Revelation. But it's still that problem where people just neglect it because they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what impact do you want this book to have on your readers? Like, how can we as modern readers of the Book of Revelation reclaim it? And what impact should this reclamation of Revelation have on the modern church?
Yeah, I think ultimately, as I was thinking about these questions in the last couple of weeks, the word that just comes back to me is read and reread, right? That's the phrase that keeps coming back to me. It strikes me as odd that most Christians are in the habit of reading scripture and rereading it, right? Like they're happy to read 3 versions of the story of Jesus that are almost identical in the synoptic gospels, and they read them, and then they read the Gospel of John. And whether it takes them 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, they'll start back over and they'll read the Gospels again, or they'll read the letter to the Colossians, year after year after year, or decade after decade after decade. And that habit of reading and rereading, I don't think is a habit that many have with the book of Revelation. And so I think, like, if I had my druthers, if I was to, wish upon a shiny star, I would hope that the impact of this book is that it encourages people not to read Revelation once and be done with it, not to, put Revelation on the shelf and never engage again, but to come back to Revelation again and again, because it's vital to our discipleship. It's vital to our sense of worship. And if we read it as part of the living and active Word of God, then it's going to be new to us every moment. It's going to be new to us each season of our lives. And if my book helps people in any way to take up and read the book of Revelation and maybe do it again in 5 or 10 or 15 years, then I would say my book has been successful, because that is ultimately what I would love to see, is people just engage Revelation as a resource in their faith, not as a strange thing that you have to be an expert to interpret, but as something that speaks to the realities of their life. And that they can wrestle with, and really find new meaning and new life in the process of wrestling.
Well, I would highly recommend everyone go out and purchase a copy of Unspoiled Endings, especially if you're new to the book of Revelation. It is a fantastic introduction. But for people that want to learn more, you probably are not going to be reading the late great Planet Earth or the Left Behind series. Those might not be the best places to
Right.
start for a historical analysis of the book of Revelation. But what are some resources that you might suggest to the members of my audience who read your book and then want to go further?
Sure. I think a really great place to start is that commentary by Blind Blunt that I've mentioned before. It's published in the New Testament Library series by Westminster John Knox. It's such a careful and theologically rich reading of Revelation. It deals with some of the technical problems as well, but it's such a robust commentary. A second one that I would recommend specific to Revelation is the book by Timothy Beale called Revelation, a Biography. And I think it's published by Yale University Press. And if you want to get a grasp, if you want to get a handle of the variety of ways in which Revelation has been interpreted throughout its history, this is like a great one-stop shop. You get Augustine, you get Luther, you get the late great Planet Earth, the rapture culture, all of that. And it's really a wonderful book that sort of helps you get a lay of the land. So those are two books that I would really highly recommend for those that are interested in going a little bit deeper in Revelation.
Well, Dr. Chris Holmes, man, we covered a lot of ground in an hour and 10 minutes. I
We
can't
did.
believe we were able to pull that off. You did an amazing job. I know this has gotten me excited about the book of Revelation, and I hope that for my audience, they've learned a lot from this. Before I let you go today, where can people find you, follow you, find more of your work? Where can they locate you at?
Yeah. So I'm not super active on the socials, but I make a lot of educational content for my church on YouTube, and so I have a YouTube channel at Rev Doctor Dr. Chris Holmes is my channel. Many of those videos are public, and encourage folks to check those out. Obviously, check me out at firstpressatl.org, which is our church website. And for your listeners, I would just give a plug for something that I did with a colleague of mine, Brennan Breed, over at Columbia Seminary called Office Hours. We did it during the pandemic. We had guest biblical scholars come in and talk about varieties of biblical books. And if you search Office Hours in YouTube, you can find that. You can see some really fun, higher level conversations about Scripture that were really fun to make, and I think have been beneficial to people in the pews.
That's perfect. Well, Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. And again, thanks for the invitation and thanks for taking my work seriously. That's the highest honor.
Again, but before we go, I got to recommend everyone needs to go out and buy it. It's such a good introduction, man. Thank you so much for writing it and talking.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.